There's something about rivers that makes them particularly good places for monster stories. You can stand on the bank and look straight at the water without having any real idea what is beneath it. The surface might be calm, muddy, perfectly ordinary, while anything large enough to avoid notice simply moves below where you cannot see it. That uncertainty has always given rivers their own kind of folklore. People tell stories about enormous fish, strange shapes surfacing at dusk, animals that seem too large for the water they live in, and things glimpsed only briefly before disappearing again.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
This message is brought to you by today's sponsor, Walden University. Set a course for change. Now is the time to make a real change in your life, career, and community. At Walden University, we give you the support and flexibility to get the W. Walden's online programs are designed for working professionals like you. You'll gain hands-on skills to take on real-world challenges and succeed. Your future is waiting, and Walden is here to help you achieve it. Take the first step to make your impact. Visit waldenu.edu. Walden University. Set a course for change. Certified to operate by Chev.
Thumbtack presents Uncertainty Strikes. I was surrounded. The aisle and the options were closing in. There were paint rollers, satin and matte finish, angle brushes, and natural bristles. There were too many choices. What if I never got my living room painted? What if I couldn't figure out what type of paint to use? What if I just used Thumbtack? I can hire a top-rated pro that knows everything about interior paint, easily compare prices, and read reviews. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
This message is brought to you by today's sponsor, Walden University. Set a course for change. Now is the time to make a real change in your life, career, and community. At Walden University, we give you the support and flexibility to get the W. Walden's online programs are designed for working professionals like you. You'll gain hands-on skills to take on real-world challenges and succeed. Your future is waiting, and Walden is here to help you achieve it. Take the first step to make your impact. Visit waldenu.edu. Walden University. Set a course for change. Certified to operate by Chev.
Hello, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Toby.
And welcome to the Whispering Woods podcast. This episode is all about...
Whitey.
Yeah, this is a cryptid, a creature feature. I really fancied doing a cryptid and I wanted to find one that we hadn't done before. And I came across Whitey. It's great, this one. I love it. But first of all, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/The Whispering Woods, where we have a number of tiers and you can listen in advance and ad-free. We're also on Apple Premium, where likewise, for $4.99, you can listen ad-free and in advance. Right, business done. Let's get straight into this one, shall we? Are you ready for the story?
Yes, I am.
By the middle of July 1937, people were arriving in Newport, Arkansas, for the chance to see something that nobody could properly identify. Several miles outside of town, beside a deep eddy in the White River, a viewing area had been fenced off and signs had appeared along the roads, directing visitors towards the place where a huge animal had reportedly been seen breaking the surface. The Newport Chamber of Commerce had become involved. People were paying 25 cents to enter, and hundreds of spectators were gathering along the bank carrying cameras, binoculars, and anything else they thought might help them catch a glimpse of the creature. The descriptions were difficult to ignore. Witnesses were not talking about an unusually large fish seen for a few seconds in muddy water, but something they believed was enormous, grey and smooth-skinned, with a body compared variously to an elephant and a railway boxcar. Bramlett Bateman, the plantation owner, whose name would become closely associated with the sightings, had gone to the river expecting to find a straightforward explanation, and instead returned convinced that something very large was moving through the eddy. Before long, simply watching it was no longer enough. Plans were made to catch it. A huge rope net began to be constructed, while Charles B. Brown, a professional diver from Memphis, was brought to Newport and prepared to descend into the stretch of river where the creature had been appearing. Brown was not particularly convinced that a monster was waiting for him below the surface, and suspected that the mystery might eventually prove to be an exceptionally large fish. But he nevertheless arrived equipped with an 8-foot harpoon. On the morning of the dive, Newport effectively stopped to watch. Hundreds of visitors lined the bank, while Brown climbed into his diving equipment and disappeared beneath the surface of the White River. Recent rain had made the water even more opaque than usual, and once he was down there, he could see only a few inches in front of his face. Somewhere in that darkness was the bottom of an eddy around 60 feet deep, and according to the people gathered above him, somewhere in that same stretch of water, there might have been an animal considerably larger than anything Brown expected to encounter in an Arkansas river. For 75 minutes he searched. He found nothing. Brown went down again later that day, and when darkness eventually came, the crowds remained beside the river, turning the occasion into what newspapers called a monster lab beneath lights erected along the bank. The following day, the diver tried again, but an air valve in his helmet jammed and sent him unexpectedly back to the surface. By then, the crowds were beginning to thin. The great capture had produced nothing, and whatever had caused so much excitement in the White River had apparently disappeared beneath it. It would have been easy for the whole thing to end there, as one strange summer in a small Arkansas town. It didn't. Because the creature people had gathered to watch in 1937 was not the first unexplained animal reported in this part of the White River, and it would not be the last. Sightings associated with what eventually became known locally as Whitey would surface across decades, with later witnesses describing something enormous moving through the water and tracks appearing along the riverbank that seemed to belong to an animal nobody could identify. Eventually the story would become unusual, even by the standards of American cryptid folklore. because more than 30 years after those crowds gathered outside Newport, reports of the creature began again. And this time, the state of Arkansas would decide that whatever was living in the White River ought to be protected. The White River begins in the Boston Mountains of northwest Arkansas before winding through the Ozarks, crossing briefly into Missouri, and eventually turning southeast through the flatter country of Arkansas towards the Mississippi. By the time it reaches Newport, the river has already travelled hundreds of miles, and for generations it formed an important part of life in Jackson County, providing transport, fishing, and access to the rich agricultural land surrounding it. Newport itself developed where the railway crossed the White River, and by the early 20th century it had grown into a busy regional centre, surrounded by farms, timber operations, and plantations. This was not an isolated settlement, where an unfamiliar animal might easily become the subject of local superstition. People worked beside the river, travelled on it, and fished its waters regularly. And whatever later witnesses believed they were seeing was appearing in a place that was very familiar to those living nearby. The White River was also capable of hiding almost anything beneath its surface. Its water could be heavily stained with sediment, visibility was often poor, and deep holes and eddies formed along its course. Large catfish and alligator gar lived in the river system, while logs, debris, and other objects carried downstream could briefly appear and disappear again, without ever being properly identified. Stories concerning something much larger apparently began circulating around Newport long before the summer of 1937. The earliest date consistently given in Arkansas historical accounts is 1915, when reports of an unusually large creature in the White River began to appear. Unfortunately, the surviving information about those first sightings is thin. Later versions have attached increasingly elaborate stories to them, including claims of enormous animals overturning boats, and even encounters stretching back to Native American inhabitants of the region. But the better documented history simply tells us that sightings were being reported around Newport from 1915 onwards. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas describes those early appearances as sporadic, with nothing approaching the excitement that would follow more than 20 years later. Then came the summer of 1937. During the first days of July, fishermen working a stretch of the White River near Newport began complaining that something was interfering with the fishing. They were having difficulty bringing in the catches they expected, and before long, reports circulated that an enormous animal had been seen in the water. One of the men who heard those stories was Bramlett Bateman, a local plantation owner whose property lay near the river. Bateman did not initially have to rely on anybody else's description. On 1st of July, he went to look for himself. What he claimed to see was an enormous grey animal lying near the surface of the White River. Bateman later described its skin as resembling that of an elephant. He estimated that the visible portion of the animal was around 4 or 5 feet across and approximately 12 feet long, although other reports attributed much larger dimensions to the creature as the story spread. Its head, according to one widely repeated description, reminded him of a catfish. It remained visible long enough for Bateman to become convinced that he had not simply mistaken a floating log for an animal. Then it sank beneath the water. Bateman began telling other people what he had seen, but he was not the only person watching the river. More witnesses were about to come forward, and within days, the quiet stretch of water outside Newport would become one of the most talked about places in Arkansas. Among the people who had been watching the river before Bateman became involved were Dee and Sylvia Wyatt, a sharecropping couple living close to the water on Bateman's land. According to an account published by Time later that summer, Sylvia had gone outside to draw water when something in the river caught her attention. She called for her husband, and the two of them watched an animal or object moving in the river that neither could identify. Later Arkansas accounts described the disturbance as looking at first like a horse struggling or drowning in the water, but when the activity continued over a period of days, the Wyatts decided that whatever they were seeing was not an animal in temporary difficulty. They eventually went to Bateman, who was their landlord, and asked him to look for himself. That brought his own sighting and his hurried journey into Newport to tell others what he had seen. But instead of ending with the Wyatts and Bateman, the reports began multiplying. Within a relatively short period, around a dozen people regarded by the contemporary press as reliable witnesses said that they too had seen something unusual in the White River. And later Arkansas accounts include a Jackson County deputy sheriff among those who came forward. Their descriptions were not identical, which is hardly surprising, when most were looking at an animal partly submerged in a muddy river. But certain details appeared repeatedly. The creature was grey or greyish, extremely broad and apparently smooth-skinned, and witnesses believed that what they could see above the surface represented only part of its body. Several said it surfaced only occasionally, remaining visible for a short time before slipping back underneath the water, while another contemporary newspaper account described witnesses hearing snorting or bubbling from below after it had disappeared. The creature also seemed to favour one particular section of the river. The sightings centred on a large eddy several miles south of Newport, where the water formed a deep, slow-moving pocket reaching around 60 feet in places. Whatever was surfacing there could disappear almost immediately into water so muddy that visibility beneath the surface was practically non-existent, allowing people on the bank to watch for hours without seeing anything, and then suddenly catch a brief glimpse before it vanished again. As word travelled through Newport, people began making the difficult journey out to the site for themselves. The road leading there was rough and overgrown, but that did little to discourage visitors, and before long there were people stationed along the river throughout the day and night, hoping to see the animal surface. Some came simply out of curiosity, while others arrived carrying weapons, apparently prepared to kill whatever emerged. For around a week, armed men patrolled the shoreline around the clock. One was reportedly carrying a Thompson submarine gun, while others brought ordinary rifles and firearms, and Bateman himself considered a considerably more dramatic solution. He wanted to use dynamite in the eddy, where the creature had repeatedly emerged, reasoning that an explosion might either kill it or force it to the surface. But local authorities refused to allow explosives to be thrown into the river. Despite the number of people now watching, nobody managed to obtain the photograph that would have settled the matter. Newspaper photographers came to Newport, but every time the creature was supposedly seen, it disappeared before a useful image could be taken. There were plenty of people prepared to say they'd watched it moving in the water, yet the evidence remained entirely dependent upon what those witnesses had seen. But that didn't stop the story spreading. Newspapers across the United States picked it up, and by the end of July, the White River Monster had become national news. Time devoted an article to Newport's mystery and reported that 12 citizens had supported the original accounts, while correspondents treated the strange events in Arkansas as one of the more colourful stories of the summer. This attention changed what was happening beside the river. The Newport Chamber of Commerce became involved. Signs began directing motorists towards the monster site, and a fenced viewing area was established where visitors could pay 25 cents for access. Local people sold food and cold drinks to the crowds, and the strange gathering beside the White River began to resemble a fair almost as much as an investigation. There was even an opportunity to view the area from the air, with visitors reportedly able to pay a pilot to fly over the river, in the hope that the animal might be easier to see from above. Waitman and others began working on an enormous rope net, intended to close off the eddy and trap whatever was inside. If that could be done, the creature that had appeared and disappeared so easily beneath the White River would finally have nowhere left to go. And while the net was being prepared, Newport brought in someone willing to go down into the water and look for it himself. The man brought in to search the river was Charles B. Brown of Memphis, an experienced diver who worked for the United States Engineers and had previously served as a Navy diver. Brown had spent around 12 years working underwater, and despite the excitement surrounding his arrival in Newport, he was not expecting to meet anything particularly mysterious beneath the White River. After speaking with the people who had seen the creature, his own suspicion was that the monster would prove to be an exceptionally large fish, possibly a catfish. While Brown searched below, theories were already being offered from much further away. The United States Bureau of Fisheries suggested that the animal might be an alligator gar, one of the largest freshwater fish found in North America, and certainly formidable enough to look extraordinary when briefly seen at the surface. Contemporary reports noted that very large gar could reach impressive lengths, making the suggestion considerably less ridiculous than it might have initially sounded to people expecting a river monster. Brown himself remained inclined towards some kind of oversized fish. The problem was that nothing he found beneath the river provided an answer. The planned rope net did not produce one either. It had been intended to trap the animal within the eddy, but the effort ultimately failed, and the elaborate attempt to capture Newport's monster began losing momentum. The armed watchers who had spent days patrolling the shoreline gradually disappeared. The visitors stopped arriving in the same numbers, and without another dramatic sighting, there was little reason for the crowds to remain. For Bateman, the outcome was uncomfortable. He'd become the most recognisable name attached to the story, and once the searches failed, there were inevitably suggestions that the entire episode had been manufactured to attract visitors. The fact that spectators had been charged admission to the viewing area made that accusation particularly easy to make. although Bateman was far from the only person who claimed to see something in the river. Then the White River became quiet again. For more than 3 decades, that might easily have remained the end of it. Then, in the summer of 1971, people along the White River began reporting something unusual in the water again. The descriptions had changed. Witnesses now spoke of an animal so large that some compared its body with a railway boxcar, and once again its colour was described as grey. One account described the surface of its body as though it were peeling, while at the same time appearing smooth. But the feature that attracted the most attention was something projecting from the creature's forehead. It looked like a horn. Other witnesses described the animal making a peculiar noise that seemed to combine the mooing of a cow with the neighing of a horse. Whatever these people believed they had encountered, it was no longer simply the broad, elephant-skinned shape reported in the river during the 1930s. The White River Monster of 1971 had acquired a much stranger appearance. This time, there was also something that could apparently be examined after the creature was gone. On Towhead Island, close to the area associated with the sightings, unusual tracks were reported leading towards the river. They were described as approximately 14 inches long, with 3 toes, and the route around them showed signs of disturbance. Bushes had been crushed, and trees or vegetation bent aside, as though something heavy had moved through the area before entering the water. Then came another piece of evidence that the witnesses of 1937 had never managed to obtain. An employee of the White River Lumber Company named Cloyce Warren reportedly photographed something in the river during the 1971 sightings. The resulting image is indistinct, showing a dark form or disturbance on the water, rather than the clearly defined animal people might have hoped for. But it became associated with the case as one of the very few supposed photographs of Whitey. Once again, nobody caught the creature. But this time the story did not simply disappear when the sighting stopped. 2 years later, a state senator from Arkansas decided there was another way of dealing with the White River Monster. Instead of hunting it, Arkansas was going to protect it. In February 1973, Arkansas State Senator Robert Harvey of Swifton introduced Senate Resolution 23, a measure dealing with an animal that nobody had ever successfully captured, identified, or even photographed clearly. The resolution formally created the White River Monster Refuge, covering the stretch of river associated with the sightings, and running between the southern point known as Old Grand Glaze and the northern point known as Rosie. Contemporary and later accounts described the protected area as extending for roughly 48 miles along the river, taking in the places where Whitey had most often been reported. The wording made it clear that the legislature was well aware of the publicity surrounding the creature. The resolution referred to sightings made by reputable people and noted the value of the now internationally famous White River Monster. It then declared that within the refuge it was unlawful to molest, kill, trample, or otherwise harm the monster while it remained in its native retreat. There was, admittedly, an element of humour to the whole thing. Senate Resolution 23 was a resolution rather than the creation of a conventional wildlife protection program, and nobody was sending state biologists into the White River to establish population numbers for an unidentified monster. Nevertheless, Arkansas has now produced an official government document specifically naming the creature and setting aside part of the river as its refuge, something very few cryptids can claim. The question of what Arkansas was protecting remained unanswered. Whatever caused the reports, the major waves of sightings began to fade after the early 1970s. Accounts occasionally place Whitey in the river again afterwards, with 1974 often given as the last significant reported sighting, but nothing comparable to the crowds of 1937 or the renewed excitement of 1971. The creature gradually moved from newspaper story into Arkansas folklore, while the stretch of river associated with it continued flowing past Newport, much as it always had. The monster hunt was over, but Whitey had managed something rather better than being caught. It had become part of the state. There have been occasional claims since the 1970s from people who believe they've seen something unusual elsewhere along the White River system. Jacksonport State Park, close to Newport, has continued to include the White River monster in its interpretation of the area, even holding guided events called In Search of the White River Monster. There is still no specimen, no clear photograph, and no agreed identification for the animal the witnesses described. And whatever moved through that deep eddy outside Newport in the summer of 1937 was never brought to the surface.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
This message is brought to you by today's sponsor, Walden University. Set a course for change. Now is the time to make a real change in your life, career, and community. At Walden University, we give you the support and flexibility to get the W. Walden's online programs are designed for working professionals like you. You'll gain hands-on skills to take on real-world challenges and succeed. Your future is waiting, and Walden is here to help you achieve it. Take the first step to make your impact. Visit waldenu.edu. Walden University. Set a course for change. Certified to operate by Chev.
It's great. It's like Nessie, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's like Bristol Zoo.
Yeah. What, the platform?
Yeah.
Spend your money to see it.
Yeah, and it, or I don't know, that's what it reminds me of, the fake ticket parking guy.
Oh, yeah.
Where he's charging people £1 to park there or something.
Yeah. We have said this before in the podcast. We don't know if it's real or an urban legend.
It's real.
But Bristol Zoo, apparently for years and years, this guy was charging whatever he was for parking. He had his high-vis on, going around collecting the money, and he wasn't employed by the council. He just set up and was like...
That, if you ask me, is
genius.
A brilliant scheme, yeah.
It's genius.
That's good, that.
And when it comes to setting up a platform, it's really enterprising, you know? Come and see the sea creature. You might see it, you might not.
Yeah.
But pay over your bit of money and you take the gamble.
Yeah.
But yeah, anything like this is great because there are so many stories and so much folklore involved with it. I think it's splendid.
Yeah, it's very good. Well, that's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
We will indeed. We will catch you again on Thursday for the Reddit and listener story episode. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Thumbtack presents Uncertainty Strikes. I was surrounded. The aisle and the options were closing in. There were paint rollers, satin and matte finish, angle brushes, and natural bristles. There were too many choices. What if I never got my living room painted? What if I couldn't figure out what type of paint to use? What if I just used Thumbtack? I can hire a top-rated pro that knows everything about interior paint, easily compare prices, and read reviews. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
As a small business owner, sometimes it feels like no matter how much planning you do, there's always surprises, like an urgent, expensive repair. But here's a surprise you'll like. With Progressive, small business owners save 10% or more on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So enjoy a surprise for once. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at ProgressiveCommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
The stories told on the Whispering Woods are inspired by historical records, witness reports, and local folklore. While every effort is made to research and represent events accurately, some details, names, and locations may differ from official accounts or have been changed out of respect for those involved. These episodes are created for storytelling and entertainment purposes and should not be considered definitive fact or investigative journalism.